Worn storytelling. When we moved into Willow Creek, it felt like we just walked onto the set of a Lifetime Hallmark movie. The kind with just enough conflict to keep you watching, but enough charm to make you believe everything would be okay in the end. The houses stood side by side like pearls on a suburban necklace, their shutters a matching shade of forest green, their porches adorned with seasonal wreaths, none a minute out of sync. And every blade of grass along the sidewalk seemed to salute us as we drove up in our U-Haul. My husband, Jason, was behind the wheel and sweating from nerves and the early spring humidity, while I clutched the lease agreement and 2 bottles of lemon-scented surface cleaner like they were sacred relics. Our home, the one we'd worked overtime and double shifts to afford, was at the end of Hawthorne Court, a quaint corner lot with a white trellis, wraparound porch, and a postage stamp-sized backyard that I imagined filling with herbs and hummingbirds. We were exhausted, but the kind of exhausted that comes with joy, the type you earn with years of scraping together savings, hunting for homes, surviving bidding wars, and dreaming under ceilings you don't own. Our neighbor, Linda, greeted us the moment we stepped out of the truck. She had a plate of cookies, store-bought but arranged like a Pinterest photo, and a coffee mug that read Home Sweet HOA. She wore the kind of smile you grow into after years of saying good morning, whether you mean it or not. "Welcome to Willow Creek," she said cheerfully, balancing her plate and her mug with veteran ease. "Just keep your lawn green and your hedges neat, and you'll never hear from them." "Them?" I asked, even though I knew exactly who she meant. She nodded slightly, as if the acronym itself had ears. The HOA. I remembered laughing, brushing it off as some suburban mythology, like rogue raccoons or neighborhood gossips with drones. How bad could it be? We weren't rowdy college kids. We didn't host loud parties or build 12-foot gnome statues. I just liked rosemary, thyme, and a touch of lavender, plants that reminded me of my grandmother's garden back in Oregon. Within a week of moving in, I had installed a tidy little herb patch along the inside of the white picket fence, complete with copper name tags I bought off Etsy and a solar mushroom light that twinkled faintly at dusk. To me, it was harmless beauty. To someone else, apparently, it was a violation of order. The first note arrived without ceremony. No envelope, no signature, just a printed slip, tucked inside our mailbox, stamped with the HOA's familiar insignia of a tree over a scroll and 2 icy words beneath it. Unapproved garden. I blinked at it, turned it over as if there might be more, some clue or even a polite explanation, but there was nothing. I handed it to Jason, who read it, shrugged, and said, "I planted herbs, not pot." We laughed, but something about the sour tone stuck to my ribs. It felt less like a note and more like a warning. That weekend, while Jason was assembling the new patio furniture and I was trimming back a section of the lavender, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize, labeled WC HOA board. I hesitated, thumb hovering over the answer button. Curiosity won. "Hello," I said cautiously. "Hi, this is Meredith from the Willow Creek HOA," came a bright, professional voice. Too bright. Cheerful the way dentists sound before pulling a tooth. "We've noticed a few irregularities in your front yard," she said. "Decorative elements and non-compliant flora. Specifically, we've identified rosemary, quite a bit of it, and unfortunately, that attracts pollinators." "Pollinators?" I asked, caught between confusion and laughter. "Yes," she replied, but in a tone that made it sound like I'd uttered a profanity. "And bees, unfortunately, pose a safety concern. Children play on the sidewalks and stinging insects," she trailed off, as if the mere existence of bees was something no civilized society should tolerate. I stammered, I didn't know rosemary was a problem." "It's not about intention," she said. "It's about compliance. You should have submitted a landscaping modification request." I bit my tongue. It was a 4-foot herb patch, not a koi pond or an extension of the Great Wall. "What do you suggest I do?" I asked, trying to sound reasonable. "Removal would be ideal," she said sweetly. "Voluntary compliance always looks best in your file." I nodded, not that she could see me, and said I'd think about it. 3 days later, we received our first fine, $75 for non-compliant landscape modifications. No hearing, no warning, just a notice and a balance due. Jason stared at it in disbelief. They can't just do this, right? But the bylaw said otherwise. I dug them out from our thick stack of closing papers, which, like every adult in a hurry, we'd barely skimmed before signing. Page after page of regulations and clauses unfolded like a legalistic nightmare. A full section dedicated to decorative consistency, another about sightline integrity, and an entire subsection on horticultural guidelines, which sounded more like a Soviet manifesto than something meant for residential flower beds. It turned out that in Willow Creek, beauty was centrally planned. Over the next week, I received 2 more reminder notices, each one colder than the last. The language escalated. Non-compliance will result in escalating penalties. Future violations may impact your community standing. And finally, legal action may be considered. For rosemary. Rosemary that I watered, clipped, and contained. Rosemary that smelled like memories. I appealed the fine, writing a calm but firm letter explaining that I was unaware of the requirement and would be happy to modify the garden to meet aesthetic standards. No response. I called the number from before. Meredith didn't answer. I emailed the general HOA contact and got an auto reply. "Thank you for your concern. The board will review your message at our next scheduled meeting," which, according to the calendar, was 3 weeks away. I was left in limbo while the rosemary quietly bloomed and my anxiety steadily grew. Linda stopped by with a tray of lemon bars one afternoon and saw me hunched over the herb patch, measuring each sprig like a botanist on the verge of madness. "They're watching, aren't they?" I asked. She sipped her iced tea and nodded. "You should have gone with boxwood. It's boring but safe." I wanted to scream, but instead I dug deeper, literally and figuratively. I spent late nights researching HOA legal loopholes, joining Facebook groups with names like HOA Horror Stories and Suburban Rebellion. I discovered I wasn't alone. There were people across the country battling similar nonsense. Flag rules, garage door colors, even the color temperature of porch lights. I posted anonymously and received dozens of sympathetic replies. One stood out. "Look at your bylaws. There's often a clause about contained enclosures. It's how some residents get around landscaping rules." I returned to the covenant, page 14. There it was, buried between 2 obtuse paragraphs about seasonal signage. Residents may cultivate personal use plants if contained within aesthetically enclosed structures not exceeding 3 by 3 feet. My heart leapt. The next morning, I went to Home Depot and bought enough cedar planks, wire mesh, and lattice to build a small army of garden boxes. Jason raised an eyebrow when I returned. "You building a fort?" "Something like that," I muttered. That weekend, we built 3 square planter boxes, elegant, painted to match the trim of the house, and fully within code. I transplanted the herbs into the boxes, labeled them with calligraphy tags, and surrounded them with small solar-powered lanterns. I took photos. I printed out the relevant bylaw. I mailed it to the HOA with a letter that simply read, "I hope this resolves the matter." But I knew, deep down, I'd just poured gasoline on a suburban fire. 2 days later, we received another notice. Yard structures obstruct visual harmony. Please remove immediately. Fine, $125. No explanation of what visual harmony meant, or who defined it, or why that clause was never mentioned before. Jason stared in the yard and looked around at the dozens of other homes with gomes, wind chimes, pink flamingos, and Christmas lights still tangled in their gutters. "This is personal," he said. "They've picked a target." And I knew he was right. What started as a patch of rosemary had become a symbol of control, of quiet defiance, and of the battle we didn't know we'd signed up for when we bought our little house on Hawthorne Court. But if Meredith and her clipboard army wanted a fight, they'll have to earn every inch of lawn. Worn storytelling. It began with that second fine, that ridiculous $125 charge for obstructing visual harmony, a phrase so vague it might as well have been lifted from a poem about fog or feelings. And that's when I realized this wasn't just about plants anymore. This wasn't about rosemary or bees or planters. It was about control, about someone needing to prove they could bend us, break us, and make us fall in line like a row of hedges trimmed to a perfect HOA-sanctioned height. And I remember standing on my porch, looking at my beautifully contained herb boxes, each one painted to match the exact cream shade used on our shutters, each one aligned with a carpenter's precision, thinking, if they think this is war, then fine, let it be war, because I wasn't going to be bullied out of basil. That night, I opened my laptop and typed HOA retaliation stories into the search bar, and what I found was a black hole of suburban drama and passive-aggressive horror, a world of tormented neighbors and fined grandmothers and emotionally exhausted dog owners whose chihuahua's bark had cost them hundreds in noise violations. I fell into the vortex for hours, reading stories about people who were told to remove patriotic bunting, people whose bird feeders were deemed disruptive, and one poor soul who was fined for having a trampoline visible from the street, though their house backed up to a field and only deer could have seen it. I realized there were thousands of us, people who bought into the dream of community only to find themselves policed by people who thought neighborhood unity meant everyone had to be exactly the same. But something else happened that night too, something better. I found a link to a private Facebook group called Willow Creek Survivors, and at first I thought it was a joke, but after I requested access and was approved by a woman named Sophia who lived 6 doors down apparently, I realized it was real. A small, tight-knit group of residents who had all been fined, threatened, humiliated, or otherwise disciplined by the Willow Creek HOA. There were 10 members, 10 stories, each more absurd than the last, and they welcomed me like a long-lost sister returning from a dystopian vacation. Sophia told me she'd been fined for placing a political bumper sticker on her mailbox, just a small sticker the size of a business card that read "Vote Local," because it introduced external influence into neutral community decor. Another member, Greg, a retired Navy vet, shared a photo of the flagpole he'd installed beside his porch. The flag itself, he noted, was regulation size, but they fined him because flag poles must be no more than 5 feet in height from ground to flag, and his was 5'2". I posted my rosemary story, complete with photos of the enclosed planters and the printed bylaw, and within minutes, the group was lit up with comments. "You're within your rights. That clause has saved me before. They hate creativity. Meredith's the worst. You're being targeted." And finally, from a guy named Travis who I'd never seen before but apparently lived around the bend, "Fight it. Make it visible. Make it public." That last comment gave me an idea, and suddenly I wasn't just angry, I was energized, fueled by something deeper than resentment, the desire to stand up for every resident who'd ever been fined for planting sunflowers 2 inches too close to a walkway. That weekend, I dragged Jason to the local craft store and bought supplies, more planters, lattice, paint, lights, signs. And together we spent 2 days transforming our front yard into a whimsical HOA-compliant garden gallery, a masterclass in rule-bending obedience. Every box was within the 3-by-3-foot regulation. Every herb, every flower, every ornamental rock was aesthetically enclosed. We added name plaques, pollinator pod, basil bay, lavender lounge, bee stop bistro. We even installed a hand-painted wooden sign that read, "All structures compliant per page 14, HOA Covenant, Section 5. I took high-resolution photos from every angle, printed them out, attached them to a polite cover letter, and hand-delivered them to the HOA Dropbox. We even included a QR code that linked to a web page we made, Our Compliant Garden, with photos, clauses, and timestamps. It was civil disobedience in the most suburban form possible. A few days later, I got a call, not from Meredith, but from Jordan, a younger HOA board member who'd seen our website and said very quietly, "This is brilliant. Just know, not all of us are with Meredith." It was the first hint I had that their perfect little board might not be so united. But Meredith wasn't done. She sent another notice, this time claiming our garden structures violated sightline consistency, another term I could not find in any version of the covenant, digital or paper. The fine, $150. Jason lost it. He printed out the notice, drove to Staples, and made 10 full-size laminated posters with the fine and the clause circled in red. Then he stuck them on our garden boxes, each one captioned with a big, bold title, "Compliant Structure, Still Fined." The neighborhood noticed. People stopped to read. A few kids took selfies with the boxes. One elderly couple laughed and told us we were heroes of horticulture. The next day, Travis from the Facebook group left a letter in our mailbox with a flash drive. It was footage from his security camera showing a board member, clipboard in hand, walking onto our property while we were at work, measuring our planters with a tape measure, then frowning and taking photos. That's when I knew we had to go bigger. We organized. Sophia helped me print flyers for a Willow Creek front yard walk, a public event where people could come by, see the yard, and read about the bylaws themselves. We weren't just defending our garden, we were educating the neighborhood. About 30 people came. Several of them were residents who'd also been fined, silenced, or embarrassed. One woman cried, telling me her son's chalk drawings were once deemed visual graffiti and scrubbed from the sidewalk. Another man said he'd lived in Willow Creek for 10 years and had always felt like he had to shrink to avoid notice. That night, I made a second web page, Willow Creek Stories. The next day, our website had 400 views. The day after that, a local blogger featured us in an article titled "The Garden That Broke the HOA." Meredith retaliated by submitting a notice of excessive yard use and threatened us with legal escalation. But we responded with a letter of our own, one drafted by a real lawyer, Jason's cousin, who agreed to send it pro bono after hearing the whole ridiculous saga. The letter demanded the HOA cease unlawful surveillance, trespassing, and retaliatory fines, citing state property laws and basic constitutional rights. It didn't end there. Linda, our sweet neighbor with the cookies and lemon bars, told us Meredith had gone door to door collecting support for amending the garden clause in the bylaws, specifically targeting us. But she also said people weren't responding the way Meredith wanted. Some were annoyed, some were curious, some were just tired of being told that their ceramic frogs or Christmas wreaths weren't community-minded. We created a petition of our own, not to remove Meredith, not yet, but to request an emergency board review of the fining process. We gathered signatures fast. Within a week, we had 70 homeowners signed on, well over the 40% required for an emergency session. The board couldn't ignore us anymore. A meeting was scheduled in the clubhouse for the following Tuesday. Meanwhile, I made sure every step we took was documented: photos, emails, recordings, witnesses. I even posted updates on our website with tags like #Plantergate and #BeRights. We'd started as passive residents, just wanting to plant some herbs, but now we were accidental activists in a quiet, controlled rebellion against performative order. And the best part? We were winning. Because every fine, every letter, every ridiculous notice made our case stronger, not just with the board, but with the community. People were waking up. The perfect illusion of Willow Creek, where order was peace and uniformity was virtue, was beginning to crack. And through those cracks, we planted something real. Rosemary, yes, but also courage, defiance, and the radical idea that a community should belong to its people, not its enforcers.
3 weeks later, under the suffocating silence of neatly trimmed trees and suspicious stares from curtain corners, we were summoned to the clubhouse, the glorified war room of our homeowner dictatorship, for an official hearing, which felt less like justice and more like being dragged before royalty for having committed the unspeakable act of not planting government-approved daisies. And as we approached the arched glass doors with Jason nervously clutching a folder stuffed with photos, timestamps, bylaws, receipts, annotated PDFs, and a few sarcastic sticky notes he added for moral support, I could already see them sitting there, 5 board members in a row behind a long wooden table meant to convey authority and gravitas, but which mostly resembled a high school debate panel trying a little too hard. And right at the center, perched like a crow in a power suit, was Meredith, the Grand Inquisitor of Shrubbery, flipping through her stack of printed violations with the smug, practiced glee of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for years. And I'll admit, I had my nerves too. My hands were sweating, and the pit in my stomach felt like it had swallowed a rake. But I wore my navy blazer like armor and reminded myself that truth, decency, and a literal copy of the Willow Creek HOA covenant were on our side. While Jason, bless his chaotic soul, wore a t-shirt that said, "I break for bees," in bold yellow font across his chest, because he said, and I quote, "We're not just fighting for us, we're fighting for pollinators." And while that shirt would later become something of a local icon, at that moment it felt like a very loud target. So we sat, side by side, facing the tribunal of lawn control overlords as Meredith cleared her throat like she was about to announce sentencing in a courtroom drama and said, "We've documented 12 infractions of Covenant Sections 3.2 and 4.5, and you've been fined a total of $675. And she tapped her stack of papers like punctuation, like some final nail in our non-compliant planter box coffin. But before she could even breathe again, Jason leaned forward, eyes sharp, and said, "We've appealed 10 of those and cited proper clauses for each one multiple times. You haven't responded to a single filing." And you could see a flicker, just a flicker, in one of the younger board members' expressions, a guy named Jordan who had the look of someone who once believed in the mission but had recently started questioning if he'd joined a cult. And he flipped through our file, Yes, we had a file. Then looked up and quietly muttered, "They've actually complied with the garden enclosure rule." And Meredith, who clearly had not expected resistance from inside the herd, pursed her lips and said, "The spirit of Willow Creek is order, not loopholes. Your front yard is attracting attention, media attention. That's disruptive." Which was rich, considering we'd only gotten media attention because she'd fined us into absurdity. But I held up a printed copy of the bylaws, dog-eared and highlighted like the holy book of the HOA resistance, and I said, calmly but firmly, "The rules don't say I can't have boxed herbs. They say they must be aesthetic and contained," which they are. So if you don't like that, you're free to change the rules, but you'll need a 75% resident vote to do that. And Jordan glanced at Meredith and nodded. "That's true." And the room tilted slightly, as if the power had shifted, and Meredith's face twitched in a way that told me this wasn't going how she planned. So she pivoted to something darker, something lower, something that felt like a dagger pulled from behind a clipboard, and said, "We also received an anonymous complaint that your yard art includes religious symbols. That's a violation of neutrality guidelines." And Jason blinked, confused, before asking, "What symbols?" And she slid a grainy photo across the table. It was a close-up of one of our garden stones engraved with a simple Bible verse, "Let all that you do be done in love." 1 Corinthians 16:14. And Jason just scoffed. "Seriously? It's a Bible verse on a rock." And Meredith leaned forward and said, "Still," but I cut her off, looking her dead in the eyes and saying, "We're Jewish." A lie so bold it echoed, "It's for peace." And Meredith froze, clearly caught between calling us liars and offending protected religious expression. And Jordan blinked and looked at his papers like they might offer a way out. And the room spiraled into a thick tension no one could quite cut through, until finally one of the more neutral board members, Susan, cleared her throat and asked, "What section of the covenant covers religious decor?" And Meredith, to her credit, didn't answer, probably because there wasn't one, at least not for private lawns. And that's when I realized the entire board was fracturing in real time, one clause at a time. And once the meeting finally adjourned with no resolution, except that they would review and respond within 14 days, Jordan pulled us aside in the parking lot and said quietly, "She's bluffing. The religious decor rule only applies to HOA-managed buildings, not private property. You're in the clear. I think she knows that." And that moment, short, quiet, but genuine, felt like a wedge driven between tyranny and its last enabler. Because over the next week, things moved fast. We filed a formal complaint against Meredith for harassment, board overreach, and procedural violation, attaching everything, screenshots of the anonymous complaint that clearly came from her burner account, doorbell cam footage of her measuring our planter boxes while we were at work, eyewitness testimony from our neighbor Linda, who had overheard her saying at bunco night that we were going down hard, and the cherry on top, a notarized letter from Jason's cousin, a real estate attorney, stating that Meredith's actions constituted a breach of fiduciary duty, targeted harassment, and defamation against residents in good standing. 10 days after that complaint was submitted, we received a mass email from the board. Effective immediately, Meredith Talbot has resigned her position as chair of the Willow Creek HOA board. We thank her for her years of service. And I will never forget the way Jason read that sentence aloud like he was narrating the fall of an empire, and how we high-fived so hard we knocked over a cup of rosemary tea onto our patio, and how Linda brought over homemade cupcakes with bees iced on top, and a card that said, "Long live herbs," and how Travis from the Facebook group printed t-shirts that said, "Planter Rebellion Survivor," and gave them away for free. and how the fines were quietly waived, the citations marked resolved, and a new line was added to the official community webpage that read, "Residents are encouraged to maintain personalized enclosed gardens within covenant regulations. Natural pollinators welcome." And how at the next HOA board election, 3 of the 5 seats flipped, including Jordan's, who ran on a platform of transparency, fairness, and less paperwork. And he actually won, with 82% of the vote. And how our story kept circulating in small blogs, gardening forums, and one weird subreddit about anti-authoritarian landscaping. And how I realized something profound beneath all the pettiness, fines, and bylaws, that this wasn't just about plants or rules or decor, but about the right to feel at home in your own home, to grow things, to breathe freely, to resist small tyrannies that chip away at your dignity, one laminated citation at a time. And how I finally walked through our front yard weeks later, the rosemary blooming, the bees humming, the herbs spilling over gently contained boxes with their whimsical names, the little decorative rock still sitting proudly with its peaceful inscription. And I smiled because we didn't just win, we grew something permanent in the process. Not just a garden, but a community.